Go ahead, Wei. You can take it from
Okay.
there.
Hello, everyone. So, welcome to our first seminar of Discourse this year, no, this half of the year. I'm pretty happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mathew Nour. Mathew is a clinical lecturer and senior research fellow at the University of Oxford. He also works as an honorary consultant psychiatrist there. He studies medicine, neuroscience, and philosophy here in Oxford, and then went on to combine his clinical training with research in London. He completed his PhD in cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University College London with Dr. Ray Dolan and Dr. Zeb Hurst Nelson. He then came back to Oxford in 2022, and his work now focuses on cognitive neuroscience, artificial intelligence in psychiatry, what we call now as computational psychiatry, and psychopharmacology. And just one more word. So the seminars since this year will be hosted by Gina Kuberg, Malia, and me. So okay, Matthew, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see my slides okay? You can see the first.
Yes.
Yep.
Oops. I'd like to see your faces as well, though, so I'm going to try and move things around. Okay, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I don't come to more of these, but it's wonderful to see how all your faces, and yeah, I'm looking forward to your feedback. I think some of you, or many of you, will have seen me giving a short version of this talk before at SIRS, etc. There's never really enough time, I think, to go into discussion in detail, so looking forward to that. The preprint for this work is now on archive as well. And you may appreciate if you've read that it's a lot to get into one talk. So we can also talk about specifics. I Please just jump in if you want to ask questions. Just unmute yourself and say something, or Rui can tell me if someone has a question. Okay, so yeah, the title is quite ambitious, but I'll sort of explain what I mean by this. So I'm trained as a computational psychiatry person. I want to understand how behavior is generated at the level of the brain, at the level of cognitive algorithms and representations. And the way we typically do this in experimental psychology and a lot of cognitive computational psychiatry as well is we run behavioral experiments. So the idea is that we can design an experiment, often quite a simple experiment, and we can observe people's choice behavior. So people can make a choice between whether a left or a right picture on a screen is valuable. The values can change, or they can make a choice between whether a grating is pointing in the left or right direction. And we then fit models to their behavior, reinforcement learning models, Bayesian inference models, and we try and infer something about the way that these states in the world are being represented in the brain. We may even do brain imaging experiments to help us understand this. And I think this has been really fruitful. But one of the things as a psychiatrist that I struggle with sometimes is that the behaviors here are really very simple. We're often asking participants to make yes or no decisions, left or right, in very, very constrained task environments. So we constrain the complexity of the world into a task which has two states, and we ask them to make a yes or a no choice every second. And we can get pretty good insights about sort of cognition that way, but the insights are necessarily limited to this low dimensional closed regime. But I think, as many of you, I guess, share, that behavior can give us much richer insights. And language is also a form of behavior. So when we observe what people say, we get a window into what they're thinking about. We get a window into how one thought leads to another thought, leads to another thought. And here I'm using thoughts in a very not very philosophically rich way, I guess. By thought, I mean reportable mental content. So typically, you will be able to report what is in your mind at that time. And what is in your mind might be a propositional statement, it might be an image, it might be an emotion, it might be a feeling. And from a representational view of mind, these are all mental states or mental representations that are sequentially ordered. So you can not only get an insight into what someone is thinking about, but also maybe the sequence of how one mental state leads to the next can give you a lot of insight into how different thoughts are associated. Potentially how knowledge is structured, how conceptual knowledge is structured. So this is a picture from a very old cartoon, but it shows a person looking at a picture and their stream of thoughts, one to the next. And you can see that it's very open-ended. You have sometimes one thought is connected to the next by sounds. Sometimes it's connected by some pictorial or image multimodal feature. And so this is the flow of thoughts, right? And here, I guess the contrast from the picture on the left is twofold. One is that the behavior is much richer. We're getting a lot of information per second rather than just a yes-no decision. And the second is it's much more unconstrained. It's much more open-ended. So the person is not forced into this left-right choice. They can think about anything they want. It would be amazing for psychiatry if we could quantify this. And I guess that's what I'm going to talk about. From a more cognitive perspective, the idea that language could be a window into cognition is obviously very old. Even in the 1980s, 1970s, 1990s, pioneers like Herbert Simon and Anders Ericsson thought that maybe you could study how people reason, how people solve problems by asking them to think out loud. So you give them a sequential problem, you ask them to talk through their thinking process, and in the end, they will maybe solve the problem or not. But in the process, you're getting a readout, almost like timestamp by timestamp, of how they are sequencing thoughts in order to get to the problem solution. And that can tell you a lot about where people make mistakes, their cognitive styles. So that's, if you want to study reasoning, language is a good window into that. Just as an aside, those of you who are interested in large language models will have noticed that the chain of thought being investigated in large reasoning models often follows this procedure. You essentially look at the intermediate scratchpad readouts of a language model to figure out how it came to a solution. But for me, there's another reason why thoughts is fascinating, and I know we have some people on the call who are also very interested and knowledgeable about this, but that is that language is a window into the abstractions, the metaphors that people use to scaffold their thinking. This is a bit of a nuanced point. I won't go too much into this detail, but what I mean by an abstraction here is almost like a knowledge template that can be reused in different environments. So I can, for example, learn about a battle and war in my history class, and then I can later use the same template of a battle or a war when describing a collaborator relationship, or a relationship with the reviewer. We're in a battle over this point. And so I think that these knowledge templates, these abstractions, can also be studied using language. And that's because an abstraction contains a lot of information. So if I can share what I'm thinking with you using an abstraction, then that's a very efficient way of communicating. And language is full of these abstractions. So this is another reason why language might be a very interesting window into a more complicated, sophisticated form of human cognition, which is very hard to study. How might we go about doing this? Well, I guess the central point of my talk today is that language models help us. And that's because language models, as you know, especially the more sophisticated ones recently, they learn very rich representations of concepts. So they embed words and sometimes even whole sentences as vectors, as points in high dimensional space. I guess this will be familiar to many of you. The oldest versions of this were simple word-to-vec models, where every word had a vectorial representation in a high-dimensional space. And these early word-to-vec models, the Mikolov papers, 2011 time, showed that actually the location in abstract semantic space captured something like a human similarity judgment, semantic similarity judgment. So when you have a domain like, for example, animals, and I know many of you have worked with animal fluency data, that's pretty good because the relationship between dog and cat, although it's context dependent, it's actually pretty uniform and universal, and it doesn't change that much depending on the context. So you can use these models to embed the words that people say in high dimensional space and look at large or small conceptual jumps, these semantic coherence measures some of you have used. Also, many of you will be interested that these same models, often word-to-vec models, but even more sophisticated transformer-based models, are increasingly used to explain neural variance, the pattern of neural activity that occurs when people listen to words or people produce words. So these language models are capturing something about conceptual structure from the way that words appear in their training text, this distributional semantics, which itself maps onto something psychological, a human similarity judgment, and possibly something neural, the way the brain represents these words. And so now this is very exciting because it means that we have a decoder. We have a way of mapping the words that people say to some cognitively meaningful representation. And that allows us to use language as a window into thought. Something which is slightly less, I guess, appreciated, though, is that I think that it's not sufficient to use language models or even sort of word-to-vec models on their own. And that's because language, the meaning of a word is highly contextualized, right? So this is an example that I like to give. Imagine someone asks you, how close are a dog and alligator? Well, dog and alligator might be very close together in meaning space if your task is to think about whether the animal has a tail, because both a dog has a tail and an alligator has a tail. But actually, if your task is to categorize these animals by their families, is it a mammal or is it a lizard? They might be really quite far apart. So then we have a problem here, which is that the vector embedding for the word dog or alligator is going to contain a lot of information in many hundreds of dimensions, but actually only some sub dimensions or some projection into a low dimensional space might capture the similarity in a particular task. So Stephen Piantadosi here calls these domain-specific transformations. So you can have a vector embedding which then needs to be transformed to make it context relevant. Now, many of you will be saying, well, hang on a minute, transformers have solved this problem. If you have a transformer, then the vector embedding for the word dog is not just on its own a single vector, but it's colored by the vector embeddings of the other words in the context in a very sophisticated way. And that is true. Transformers do allow us, through a cross-attention mechanism, to contextualize the embeddings of any word. However, there is a problem, which is that in cognitive science, in psychology, sometimes the context that determines how a word is embedded is very explicit. It's obvious in the surrounding text, but sometimes it's not explicit. Sometimes it's very implicit. It may be in the mind of a person. There may be features of the environment which are dictating the context that are nowhere to be found in the text that you're embedding. And so how do we get around this problem of implicit context? And I guess that's what I want to talk about a bit. And the way I will talk about it is using a study that it's a very kind of a toy example, really. It's a study using a data set called the Cinderella data set, which I'll explain to you in a moment. But it's essentially a large data set of people telling the same story. So online data set. So the story we're telling is the story of Cinderella. We have 1,000 people doing this. They're also doing other things. So they're also telling us about their daily routine. They're also completing psychiatric questionnaires. And what we can use this data set to answer is the question of, can we actually use LLM representations as a window into their cognitive organization, their conceptual organization? How good can we predict where someone will go in conceptual space given our representation? I think Isaac Fradkin will be talking about this data set again at some point, potentially even next week. I can't remember, but it's a data set which is from him as well. He analyzed it in a very different way. So the data set is as I've said, it's 1,000 people from the general population, prolific study online, and each of them told the story of Cinderella. I'll just speak about Cinderella for now, but there are other things they did which make the results stronger and more interesting. And so what we want to do, the general idea is we want to take the words that people say and do some pre-processing and embed those words as points in representational space. And here, I guess the key thing that I want to communicate is that we're not embedding individual words. I'm not embedding Cinderella is about a girl with every word has a jump. Instead, what we want to do is we want to use the language as a marker of the mental state the person has in their mind right now. And that mental state might be closer to a sentence or an utterance than a single word. So Cinderella is about a girl who was a housekeeper. Maybe that's a single mental concept that needs to be embedded in space. And then the next mental concept is something like she hated her stepmother and stepsisters, for example. So there's a bit of a discussion point here about what defines a concept, what is the resolution of a concept. But really what we're talking about here is sentence embeddings. And I just want to point out that this is not a million miles away from what some companies are now doing. There was a paper from Meta, this large concept model paper, which was arguing exactly the same thing. It was arguing that what we would like to do is allow language models to embed entire sentences rather than entire words, and that might help with reasoning processes. Okay, so we unfortunately don't have beautifully ground truth markers for where one utterance ends and another one begins, because this is naturalistic text. It doesn't come punctuated. This is just one example of a start of a transcript. And so the first thing to do is to break this transcript down into sentences, into utterances, something called semantic embedding, semantic segmentation. And then we want to embed each utterance into a high dimensional vector space. In this case, I'm using the representation from a sentence embedding model, something like an S-BERT model. Now, what I've skipped out here is how we do this segmentation. I think it's really interesting. I worked a long time to figure out ways to do it that satisfied me. It's all in the paper, but for sure we can talk about that. It's a bit of a technical point. But essentially, I'm using a data-driven approach to segment somebody's narrative into utterances. So I'm not using sliding windows, although sliding windows work as also. It's pretty robust. And I'm not using human annotators. Instead, what I'm asking is, I'm using a language model pipeline to ask, in a data-driven way, where would I have to put the break such that the utterances that emerged captured a single unit of meaning? And I'm using this it's a very LLM-based pipeline. It compares the semantic embedding of each candidate utterance to a collection of ground truth good utterances. So to ask the question, essentially, for this participant, what is the break? Where are the breaks such that this participant has a really good segmentation? So I think where most analyses would stop is probably here. Most analyses would say, we have our narrative, we segmented the narrative, and now we embed the narrative utterances. And now we can calculate cosine similarities between one sentence and the next. And we can do lots of really interesting analyses. We can do semantic jumps, we can do dimensionality reduction, we can do all kinds of things. But I guess my sense is that this embedding space, which is, by the way, over 1,000 dimensions, I've only shown 5 dimensions here, this embedding space is not appropriately contextualized. What I mean by that is the person has been told to tell a particular story, the story of Cinderella. Now, the person knows that story, and that story has a certain structure to it. And that information about the structure of the story, it is possible that information is already in the sentence embeddings that we get from a pre-trained model, but it's likely that much of that information is kind of implicit as well. So it may be that we can take this base embedding and apply a transformation to it, which is supervised by knowledge of the Cinderella story that we as an experimenter know is there, but the model, the semantic embedding model, does not know about because it's not in the text. And if we apply this transformation, it's a decoding-based approach, supervised decoding approach. We can end up with each utterance being embedded in a different representational space, which is different in its dimensionality. It has fewer dimensions. It's what I call more task aligned. So what I mean by this is if you look at the semantic space, every dimension, every axis of this semantic space doesn't really have an intrinsic meaning. You can't look at an SBERT model and say axis 1, that means, Cinderella was at home with her parents, and axis 2 is about the grand ball with the prince. It's not a condition aligned axis set. Whereas the transformation brings us into a new space, which I call a schema space, which has been designed by me as an experimenter. It's been designed such that each axis actually has a meaning, has an intrinsic meaning for this task. So axis 0 here is the first event in the Cinderella story. Axis 1 is the second event in the Cinderella story, and so on. And there is clearly an experimenter input here, but actually a lot of this labeling and event identification is done by language models. So it's a kind of hybrid between a data-driven approach and an experimenter-guided approach, but actually it's a language model which is generating the structure of the story, is doing the labeling of the utterances, and then we train machine learning classifiers to map from one to the other. And this allows us to do this in all 1,000 stories pretty easily because it's all data-driven. So now what we have is we kind of have the same story, the Cinderella story, represented in two different embedding spaces. We have a semantic space, which is very high dimensional. It's coming from a pre-trained language model. And we have something like a schema space, which is something which I'm suggesting is closer to the representation the person actually has in their mind. And we can do lots of analyses comparing these two spaces. I quite like these visual representations, so you'll see lots of these, but I think we can represent the semantic space narrative as a trajectory where each utterance is a dot. And here I'm just showing you the first three axes of the semantic space so that every utterance is a point in semantic space and the entire narrative becomes a journey or a trajectory through this space. This is just showing you the first three axes. There's 1,500 axes in this space. So we can get a more complete picture by looking at something called the representational geometry, which is to say that for every utterance, what is its cosine distance to every other utterance? And so obviously this big yellow diagonal is showing you the self-similarity being maximal, and then the off diagonal shows you how similar utterance 1 is to its utterance 2 or utterance 3. And this is taking into account all 1,500 dimensions, so all the information that is in the pre-trained model. But we can do exactly the same analysis in the schema space, and what you find there is a very different geometry. So it's the same story, just embedded in a different space. And here the trajectory, this is just one example, of course, but it looks a little bit more linear. It looks more orderly. It starts in a particular place, it moves around, and it doesn't really go back on itself. There's no crisscrossing. Whereas in the semantic space, on the left, there's a lot of crisscrossing. It looks very jumbled. But more importantly, if you look at the representational geometry, which takes into account all the dimensions of the schema space, so it's comparing everything in the schema space to everything in the semantic space, we see a very, very different structure. And the structure we can see is a block diagonal structure. So some of you will already realize what that means, but just to make it explicit, what that means is that the similarity between one utterance and a nearby utterance is very, very high, and then it jumps. And then it's very, very high, and then it jumps. So you have this kind of almost these topic or event boundaries. So someone talks about the same event, the same region of semantic space or schema space here for 4 or 5 sentences, and then they jump to another region, and then they jump to another region. And crucially, they don't come back. So if you look at the off diagonals, these kind of the upper triangle, it's all very dark blue, which means that if someone visits one region of the space and you fast forward 10 utterances down the line, they don't come back to that same region. And this is a reflection of, for me, the fact that the schema space really is capturing something very cognitively meaningful about this task, in that we know that this task is a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the schema space is embedding the trajectory such that it starts in one region, moves to another region, and moves to another region, and doesn't loop back on itself. We can more formally compare these two spaces, though. So we can say, let us take any 2 utterances in a given narrative and compare its cosine similarity. And we can do that for semantic space and schema space. And we can do that over all 1,000 stories. And if we do that, then we end up with a kind of representational similarity between the 2 spaces. So if they were perfectly aligned, if they captured the same information, this would be a perfect correlation. But it's not perfect. It's really quite scattered. While it's a positive correlation, which means that if 2 utterances are close together in semantic space, they're generally close together in schema space, actually it's very, very noisy. So we can find an utterance, for example, this one, this pair of sentences or utterances, which are very high in their semantic space similarity. I've just realized that my axes are mislabeled. It should be schema similarity and semantic similarity. So this is very high. So the sentence Cinderella wears rags and Cinderella wears a ball gown are very, very similar in semantic space. And the reason for that is because they both contain the same person, they both contain the same verb, and they both contain the same noun. It's an item of clothing. But actually, in schema space, in the space of the story, these are quite far apart. Cinderella wears rags is something at the start of the Cinderella story, and it's only much, much later after her transformation that she wears a beautiful ball gown. So you find that this red star is high in one dimension but low in another dimension. A more extreme example is something like this. So Cinderella wears a ball gown and a carriage made of food, the food being a pumpkin, the carriage is a pumpkin. That is very, very similar in schema space. And the reason for that is because they both relate to the same event. Cinderella is transformed into her ball gown. She then rides the carriage to the ball, and so they occur very close in time in the Cinderella story. But actually, in semantic space distance, they're very, very not similar. They're very low down on the similarity axis. So this is a reflection of the fact that these semantic and schema distances, these spaces, are different hypotheses about how close or far concepts are in conceptual space, in the mind of the participant. And I can show you a few diagrams of what this looks like if we start looking at the entire sample. And you might begin to get some intuitions for which one is better from a cognitive science perspective. So the first thing we can do is remember there are 1,000 people, and each person is giving us maybe 15 utterances. So here I'm just plotting each utterance as an embedding in a 2-dimensional projection of the schema space, of the task-aligned space. And I've color coded them. So the ones in blue are at the start of someone's story, someone's narrative, and the ones in red are at the end of someone's narrative. And you can already see that there is a real structure to this schema space, that there are regions of the space which collect the utterances at the start and regions of the space that collect the utterances at the end. If we just pick out 10 good participants and plot their trajectories, then we see that there is a real structure here. But actually, it really is the case that people do chain together utterances that move along a shared trajectory of this schema space. This is just the 10 really good people who have very low curvature in their trajectories. But if you average together all 1,000 people, you still see this structure here. So there are some regions that if you find an utterance in this region, you have a very high probability that you know where the next utterance will be over 1,000 people. And we can decompose the story into events, and we can also ask, well, where is the centroid of each event of the Cinderella story? So event 1 is at home with her stepmother, event 3 might be at the ball, and we find that the centroids also cluster along this ring, and that actually the displacement from a particular centroid is quite non-uniform. There's a real directionality, so that if you are in this event, you're very likely to go to the next event. This is all the schema space. This is all the space that has been transformed to be task relevant. If we look at the semantic space, which is just the one that we get from a sentence embedding model, then we see a very different kind of structure. So there is still some structure in the sense that there are regions of the semantic space which are more start-like and regions which are more end-like. But if we pick out the 10 best trajectories, we see it's a real mess. Like, these are the 10 least curved trajectories. I haven't cherry-picked bad ones. And again, if we look at the flow fields and the schema events, we find that it's much more messy. So this is all kind of high-level images and to build an intuition. But how can we more formally compare these two spaces? And here I'll just whiz through, and I'll do this quite quickly because we don't have a lot of time, but this is where the questions might come. What would we need to see to conclude that the schema space is a better cognitive representation of the semantic space? Not just that it looks better, more pretty, but it's actually more meaningful at the level of mental states and conceptual organization. So I think that there are, in the paper we describe 4 things, but I'm sure we can think of more. And I'll talk you through what I mean by these 4 things. So the first is what I call representational alignment. And this is the idea that if we all now decided to tell the Cinderella story, and we all really knew it, then we should all move through a similar sequence of mental states. So we should think about event 1, then event 2, then event 3, etc. And we will all report our mental states using different words. I will speak differently to many of you. But if the representational space is good, then when we embed each of our utterances in the representational space, the representational space should be able to deal with that noise of the different words being used, and still map us to very similar regions of the correct region of conceptual space, such that our trajectories should be aligned. And one way of measuring alignment is to say, if I take a participant and embed their trajectory in schema space, can I predict, is that trajectory probable given the trajectories of all the other participants, of like 900 other participants? Because if it is, it means that my new trajectory, the trajectory of the new participant, is moving along an aligned representational trajectory to everyone else. And we find when we do this, the alignment in the schema space, is much, much higher than in the semantic space metric. So the bottom line here is that schema spaces map different participants' narratives in a way that makes them more predictable relative to each other than semantic space. And the reason it does that is because it can deal with the noise that's coming from the way different people are expressing the same event. Another metric which is related is something I call task congruent geometry. And this takes a little bit of explaining, but it's not complicated. So the idea is that some tasks, a narrative, a story is a very good task, which has this property, have a property that two states are close together in representational space if they are close together in task space. So with a story, event 1 is closer to event 2 than it is to event 3. Because the story, each event is embedded within a timeline, and the timeline goes from beginning to middle to end. So that's what I mean by task geometry. So a story can be thought of as a series of states within a number line. And so the distance between any two states in the story is simply the distance between those two states in the number line. Now, if a representational embedding matches that geometry, what that means is that the distance in meaning space, in embedding space between somebody's first utterance and somebody's second and third and fourth utterance should grow as a function of time. It shouldn't be random. It shouldn't be Brownian. You shouldn't have loops back. The more time that has elapsed, the further away you should get. And that is what is called a task congruent geometry, and we can quantify that. And again, we find when we do that, the schema space has a much cleaner task congruent geometry. Now, these two things that I've just described to you, the alignment and also the task congruent geometry, they have predictive validity. So remember that what we did for these participants is we asked them to complete many, many questionnaires, psychometric questionnaires. And some of those questionnaires pertain to schizotypy. We call the schizotypy factor eccentricity. This is what Isaac called it in his paper, so I reused the term. But these questions that pertain to this factor, they are things like, people sometimes say I describe things in confusing ways. So they're about communication. The person is self-reporting about themselves. And when we ask the question, can any of these properties, these geometric properties, predict that? What we find is that both in alignment and in momentum, it is the schema space measure that predicts eccentricity, not the semantic space measure. So for me, this is very important because what it says is that these geometric properties actually are meaningful for behavior that is outside this task. And they are more meaningful than semantic space measure, the same measure constructed in semantic space. And this is a multiple regression. So we're including both of these terms in the same equation. And we're finding essentially that the semantic space measure has no predictive validity here. And even if you just do the regression with a single predictor, it still also has no validity, no predictive validity. So that's quite provocative because what it means is that if you were to calculate something like the linearity of a trajectory in an S-BERT model, this analysis is saying it doesn't predict very much. So it may not be a good model for the way that concepts are organized or sequenced in the mind. I'll show you the fourth feature of a good representation, but this is by far the most, it's the hardest to explain, but I think it's worth showing you guys, and it's very rare I get to show people this because I usually run out of time. So this fourth feature is the abstraction. And here, I'll just give you an example of what I mean by abstraction. So abstraction is this idea that you can have the same structure repeating across different contexts. So this is an example of a family tree on the left, and Alice and Bob are brother and sister, and if Jane is Alice's daughter, then we know that Jane is the niece of Bob. So we can learn what a family structure looks like. But then when we meet a new family, one we've never seen before, we can use that knowledge of what families are, how they're structured in the new domain. So we have this reuse of information from one domain to the next domain. Metaphor works this way, analogy works this way, but a lot of cognition works this way. Now, how could we go about studying? So I guess a core point is that we think that the cognitive map representations, the way that knowledge is organized in the mind, needs to have this abstraction built in, because so much human thought is based on abstraction, based on transferring knowledge between domains. It's what makes humans so flexible and good at learning new skills. So we measure abstraction in a very simple way in this task, but I think it has a lot of implications for what we could do going forward with more complex tasks. And I'd love to talk to any of you about this, because I think it's really exciting. Okay, so in order to explain this, I have to remind you of something, that people didn't just describe the Cinderella story in this task. They described the Cinderella story, and they also told us about their daily routine. Now, these are quite different things, but you might think that actually there is a commonality between them, because they both involve a timeline. A story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A day has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Therefore, one idea is that even though the Cinderella story has very specific things happening at the beginning, the middle, and the end, there still might be some aspects of beginningness that are reused when telling the daily routine. So the idea here is that you can imagine you watch 10 Disney movies. When you watch your 11th Disney movie, it might not be so surprising when the hero of the story defeats the enemy at the end, because you kind of know it's going to happen, because that's the way a story is structured. So it's a similar kind of idea. It's a schema, essentially. So one way we can test this is by doing something called cross-condition generalization. So we can train a schema space on the utterances, the semantic space embedding of the Cinderella story. So remember, what these decoders are is these decoders map from that they introduce knowledge about the Cinderella story into the semantic space embeddings. But we can use those decoders and actually use them to decode or embed the utterances from the routine story. So we're saying, what would the utterances in the routine narrative look like if they were projected into the space of the Cinderella story? Now, you might say that should be nonsense. There's all kinds of information about the Cinderella story which is not relevant to the routine story. And that's true. But what we find when we do this is that above chance, above zero, we find that the Cinderella space captures a kind of directionality in the routine story. And the way we measure this metric is, I haven't really explained it, but it's quite simple, really. It's to say that, is there more evidence that someone moves from event 1 to event 2 than there is that they move from event 2 to event 1? So is there like a forwardness to the way they are moving through the schema space? And we find that it happens very slightly above chance, even when you're applying the wrong decoder. So if this was total noise, then this will be at zero. There will be no directionality or sequentiality of evidence. I can answer more questions about how this was done, because I realize I haven't gone into it. But to get some insight as to why this might be the case, I guess in the last result I will show you, we can do something quite it took me a long time to try and figure out what is going on here. Why is this working? And a lot of discussion with Isaac. And in the end, I think I found a way to shed some light on it. And that's this idea that some of you will be familiar with, that this is work from Ev Fedorenko, so this is not my work, but there's this idea that even within these high dimensional spaces, there might be low dimensional axes which capture abstracted information. So Ev Fedorenko here, what she's showing is that you can embed animals in a high dimensional space, and you can find a low dimensional projection, which is the line moving from smallness to bigness. Now, smallness and bigness, this is an abstracted feature. You can have small animals, you can have small countries. It doesn't matter what you're talking about, the same abstraction occurs. And Ev Fedorenko found that when you find such a dimension and you project animals onto it, it's a dimensionality reduction, where the animal lies on that line in semantic space is meaningful. The small animals lie on the small pole, the large animals lie on the large pole. So I thought this is kind of interesting. Could we find a similar line, similar projection, where we weren't mapping from small to big, but we were mapping instead from start to end? So the idea there is that utterances from either the Cinderella story or the daily routine story, if you map them onto this start to end line, should align themselves along the story number line. That's evidence that these embeddings have abstracted information. And we can do this, and it works, and the results are in the paper, the validations are in the paper. But more interestingly, what we find is that we can then use this embedding dimension, this start to end embedding dimension, to actually drive the decoders for the Cinderella story or the daily routine story. So what I mean by this, and this is not going to be easy to understand, but if you look at the top plot here, this is the Cinderella schema space decoders. So there are 7 of them. There are 7 events in the Cinderella story. Decoder 0 is the first event of the story. And what I'm doing here is I'm just saying that let's take every single utterance and decode where, on average, where it lies on, what does the decoder predict for this utterance? And then we take every utterance and just move it either towards the start or towards the end of this abstracted number line. And what we find is something quite striking, which is that if we take the utterances and move them to the start pole, so to make them more blue, the decoder for the first event gets more and more excited. If we move them towards the end pole, the decoder gets less and less excited. But the opposite pattern is true at the end of the story. And the same thing is true in the routine decoders. Here at the bottom, there are 11 rather than 8 events here. But the same is true. You have this flipping. So what this means is that the decoders that have been trained on the Cinderella story to tell you whether this utterance is at the start, middle, or the end of the story, or the Cinderella story, are capturing something about Cinderella, but they're also capturing something about startness or endness in abstraction. And we do a number of analyses in the paper to show that this is valid, and this is also very predictive. So I guess this is just some additional evidence that maybe the schema spaces are capturing not just something very specific about the Cinderella story, but something more abstract about the story schema itself. So in the paper, we argue that these 4 features, alignment, task congruent geometry, predictive validity, and abstraction, show us that this transformation is worth doing. You get a better representation. And this aligns, I think, with lots of recent work, more theoretical work, arguing that, vector representations are really good representations of mental content, and we may need to learn how to use them. The reason I'm excited by this, potentially, this is my last slide, is that we can not only study things like reasoning or abstraction now using language, we have to develop the methods a bit, but I think it's possible. But this now allows us to study these same cognitive processes in much more naturalistic environments, potentially even in clinical environments, without having to train participants to use, to do tasks which are very laborious, take a long time. So thanks to you all, and thanks to my collaborators, and happy to answer any questions. And sorry if some of that was a bit rushed, but I made the choice to push through rather than to slow down. Happy to hear questions. I can see some in the chat already.
Thank you very much, Matthew. This was a great talk. It was very interesting. We have already seen some of these. We have some questions already, but since I am already talking, I will take advantage of my position now and I will make the first question. So what you have shown here, this schema, has a very particular geometry, as we can see. So I was wondering if you expect in another kind of the discourse type, like, I don't know, argumentative discourse, will you think that this will be different? We have seen in patients that they behave differently in another kind of measures, like similarity, for example. So maybe in this case, with the semantic scheme, we can see even in not patients like normal people, if you expect to have different trajectories in different types of discourse.
Yeah, I think that's a key question. It's something that I spoke to Lena about recently. I think that this is, for me, the next exciting thing to do. So everything I've shown you, it is like even the Cinderella story or the routine story, there's actually a pretty closed structure. There's like a beginning, a middle, and end. You move through the sequences in a linear way. Another domain like picture descriptions, there's no linearity here now. You can choose where you start to describe, you can choose what you end to describe. What you're talking about, Maria, in terms of conversations or arguments, that's even more open-ended. So I think there is a big question here about this. So what I'm presenting to you is with this very simple regime of stories where we know the ground truth, does this work? And I think I'm basically that's what I'm now confident to say this works in this simple regime. And I also have ideas for how we can take it forward to more open-ended regimes. And I very much expect that you will see differences, not just between people, but between the regimes. So I think storytelling will have a different geometry to picture description. It won't be as picture description are not as linear. So the short answer to your question is yes. How do we do that? I have some ideas, but it's going to take some methods development. So I share some of those ideas in the discussion of the paper. So you can try and find topics or events in a more data-driven way using topic modeling. But I think it's going to be kind of hard to bring it to a really open-ended regime just yet. But I want to try, and I think it's going to be cool to try. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. I know that Lena has his hand, but we have some questions first that they were put in the QR. Shrakla Pandey, do you want me to read it or you want to ask by yourself?
Yes.
I'm sorry if I didn't say correctly your name. I apologize.
That's all right. I'm Shankla. The question I had, did you test for or were you thinking of other dimensions in the schema space other than event? And I understand that there is this time component in the story, how Cinderella story progresses, and it might be very easy to expect some kind of linearity, as you said, from all the participants. But were there other contenders that you considered?
The last word, were there other what? Sorry, I didn't hear that. Are there other things
Other
that I considered?
dimensions that you considered for
Yeah,
schema
so
space?
So I think these are two excellent questions. So it's really what this schema space is saying is that the task of Cinderella is the task of moving through 8 events. You need to remember the events in the correct order. So that's what we tested. But really, the broader definition of schema space is just the task relevant dimensions. So I didn't do this in this task, but you can imagine, for example, in something like picture descriptions, this relates to Maria's question as well, maybe. You can imagine the dimensions may be the things in the picture, or they may be dimensions of like self versus other, social versus non-social. So I think you can define the dimensions. At the moment, this is an experimenter defined thing, but I think you could identify those dimensions potentially using topic modeling. So you can say, what are the clusters which emerge now? And in the paper, I show that it's possible to do this with the Cinderella story. I think the challenge, though, is that it becomes to be a bit of a model comparison problem. So now I can define multiple different ways of doing this and which one is the best. And I think that it becomes a bit open-ended. And briefly to your second question, linearity is one thing we measured for sure, which is I've shown you some of it, but we also measure things which are not linear as well. Like I measure, for example, to what extent an abstracted a narrative mirrors the abstracted template versus not. So there are many, and predictability. So there are many things, many features, probably 5 or 6 of them in the paper, which we measure and which we find predict this eccentricity measure. Linearity is just one of them. Predictability is a key one. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Great work.
We
Thanks.
also have a question from Letitia. Do you want to say it by yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for the talk. It's very interesting. So I just wonder, how did you define the schema that you use to train the model, and are they selected somehow automatically or manually?
So in this case, the schema is really simple. The schema is the events of the story. So I asked GPT-4 in multiple rounds using multiple different kind of what are the events of the story. You can get a consensus schema which emerges from that. So you can basically say, if I ask the model 10 times, what are the events which keep coming up? So it's all in the paper. I also, as I was mentioning, try a more data-driven approach. So I said, look, let's not use a GPT-4 model to do this. Let's do topic modeling to see what are the clusters of utterances which emerge. The problem with that, and I used BERT topic, which many of you are familiar with, the problem with that is there's lots of hyperparameters. The question is then, if you generate 45 different solutions using different UMAP and clustering hyperparameters, how do you know which of these are good? And one of the things that I found, which is quite pleasing, is that the best BERT topic solutions for defining the schema space were basically those that were closest to the GPT-4 defined schema space. So I think this works when the model, GPT-4, knows the story. But if you're now talking about like a picture descriptions task, I wonder, like, could a image to text model help you here? Could you pass the image to the text to the model and say, what are the things in this? I think there's lots of things we could do, but if you ask me, what is the biggest area of future research? It's this. It's how do we define schema spaces in more open-ended designs? I think it's going to be a huge open question. It's a bit like how do you analyze resting state brain imaging data? It's like there's many ways of doing it, and different people differ on what they think is the best way.
Thank you.
Okay, we also have some questions of Sunny. Do you want to ask something?
Yeah,
Not sure if
thank you.
already answered.
Yeah, thank you. Great talk. Yeah, some of it was, but if I could ask a quick follow-up question to that, to Letitia's, and then ask another one. The follow-up being, so I mean, that's really interesting how you defined the schema to map onto. In order to encode the embedding space for the utterances into schema space, did you do this? Did you do this with like a labeled data set where you labeled like certain utterances into the schema? Yes. Okay. That's
Yeah,
how you, yeah.
yeah, and again So it's a supervised classification algorithm. It's just a logistic regression. It maps from
Yeah.
high dimensional schema space into a label, into a probability distribution over labels. How do I get the label training set? I use LLMs as judges. So it's LLMs all the way
Okay.
down, right?
Yeah.
And so you end up with this sparsely labeled data set from which you get a richer decoded representation. Which when I was doing this originally, I was thinking, is this a bit circular? Like, what's going on here? Why does it even work? Because I was doing it partly because it was quick, but then my friend Daniel, who's the second author on the paper, pointed me to this machine learning literature on model distillation from Jeff Hinton and others, where this is apparently known to work. You get a sparsely labeled data set and you use it to generate a soft labeled data set. And that soft labeled data set, it has a certain confusion structure to it. And that confusion structure maps on, yeah, it gives you so it's all in the paper. But yeah, that's how we do it. By the way, I do present alternative approaches which don't involve this at all. So BERT topic is
Mhm.
one such approach in the paper. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you. And the other is, I think you already I asked about, generalizing this to less temporally ordered contexts. And you said you thought about that and you think it might work. I was wondering if you could elaborate on those thoughts and how we might think
Yeah.
about,
So
picture descriptions or even an argument like Maria brought up. Yeah.
yeah, I think argument's going to be hard, but I mean, I've spoken to Lena about this, and basically I tried to do this in some of the discourse data set early on, like 2 years ago. Lena was kind enough to speak to me about it, and I think it's worth returning to it now because I now think the models kind of work a bit better. I think it comes down to identifying in a particular task setting, so a picture, let's say, what are the key states here. So in a story, the states are like the events or the characters, but in a picture, it's not events. Everything is there in front of you. So the question is like, what are the objects, for example? The question of how you do that in a way which is robust, which is data driven, I think is open to interpretation. So I think you could get humans to label the pictures in a prolific sample and pool their labels and say, okay, well, this is the ground truth set. You could do topic modeling. You can use an image to text model to do it for you. Um, but the validity of the approach is always going to be how good is that data is that feature definition. In arguments and conversations, yeah, I mean, I don't know how to do that. I have some ideas, then
Yeah.
they'll be good. They'll be as good as yours. We can talk about it another time, I guess. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, Matthew, for your answer. And finally, Lena,
Uh,
you get to talk.
Okay, Maria. I don't know if we're running out of time, Matthew. We can catch up later as well, if not. Okay,
Happy to answer your question. Yeah.
great. This is excellent talk and beautifully explained. Thank you very much, Matt. Really enjoyed it. So my question is really following up on what everybody else has brought up. How else do we define schema space? I think you're really relying heavily on event boundaries, which are time related. So story has a time sense, so you can capture that. I guess the context that we generally use in conversation has two other axes. One is the place axis and the person axis, time, place, and person. And at least when I talk to people, I try to be more strict on the time sense when I speak about, describe something. I don't confuse yesterday with today. I don't really go back and forth between yesterday and today, but I do a lot with person and place. So
Okay.
defining events, defining schema using the other two axes in a task like argument or picture description might be a little bit more difficult, I think. I don't know whether there's any empirical data comparing these different kinds of axes. What is your thought on that?
Um, Yeah, I mean, on the first point, I think I hadn't thought about it in that way, but I mean, as you know, some of the work I did during my PhD was about reorganizing sequences and things. And I think that there are these primitives like temporality, which are very strong organizing primitives that we use to organize experience, right? And so therefore it makes sense to me that even if I experience things in the wrong order, I'm going to try and reorganize them according to cause effect relationships, putting them into a number line, right? So what that means is that mentally, in my conceptual organization, things which are close together in time are close together in mental space, even though they may be quite far away in experience space. I may have heard about them at different times or something. Um, when it comes to picture descriptions, I, you know, I guess a lot of time what people are doing is trying to construct a narrative with the picture, right? They're trying to make sense of how did we get to this particular, like the man and the woman, have they had an argument? Has the man betrayed her? Whatever, you know. But I think people are going to come to different, they're going to come to different explanations, right?
Mhm.
So even just thinking out loud here, one of the things that might be fascinating is to think, can we, in like, given the order in which people are sampling the picture topics, can we make some inference as to how they have structured these things in a more narrative way, even if they haven't themselves expressed this? So you may have, for example, you may find that in your data set, you have 2 or 3 clusters of how people describe, like sequence through the picture objects. And actually, if you ask them afterwards, what do you think happened? They may actually, that description may map onto these clusters. So it's a way of saying, it's not always going to be time, but it's a way of saying the way you sequence through the events or the features of a picture tell you something about the latent organizing principles, even when those are not expressed. And here in the Cinderella story, we're basically cheating because we're basically saying the latent organizing principle is a Cinderella story. We know what that is already. But what you're talking about is doing something a bit more like a reverse inference, which I think would be so cool to do. I expect it's a data size problem. The more data you have, the more you could do that. But I'd love to talk about that kind of thing with you in your group because I think it's cool. Yeah.
Having been married for 60 years, 16 years, I feel like arguments might have a finite number of tracks as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think you could find that. The question is, how do you move from the descriptive space to something more saying, yeah, I agree.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answer, Matthew. We're a bit
Pleasure.
late, but if anyone has any other question, maybe we can do one more. If not, I just want to remind you that we have the upcoming seminars, and in October 10, we have Anthony Jacobon, and on October 24, we have Eric Chen. So I really hope that you participate on those two. Same hour, same link, same everything. And no other questions then? Okay.
Great.
So thank you very much, everyone, for participating, especially you, Matthew, for this wonderful talk. And
Pleasure.
yeah, we're looking forward to read all this very soon, and especially with patience, right?
Well, let's look. I would love to talk. I'm not doing. Yeah, let's talk. Like I'm open to emails. I'd love to talk to you. Thank you for having me. Speak to you later.
Okay. Thank you very
Bye
much.
bye.
Have a great weekend.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Matthew. Bye.